Unsupported anvils. With commercial primers, the anvil will always be seated proud. It will always stick up and out of the primer cup by a few thousandths. Primer pockets will always accommodate for this difference by being a little deeper than the overall height of the primer. With commercial or homemade primers, you should always be aware of these differences or the gaps that are involved. For small primers, the data can vary a little bit, but as far as the external dimensions are concerned, all the dimensions, according to SAMI, are essentially the same. The depth of the primer pockets, however, can vary a little bit, but ideally, two conditions will be met. For commercial primers, the primer pocket will be deep enough to accept the primer and its proud anvil to where the primer is not sticking out proud itself, and the legs of the primer's anvil should be in full contact with the bottom of the primer pocket. But because different manufacturers may seat their primers at different heights, you may be using all the same primers, but you happen to seat them differently. My main point is primer reloaders tend to set our anvils flush with the top of the primer cup and not protruding proud like commercial primers. I'm going to name these gaps so it's easier to explain my concerns. The primer seating depth is how far the primer cup is seated within the primer pocket, and the anvil seating height is how far the anvil is protruding or sticking out proud out of the primer cup. The flash gap, those are the three holes beside the anvil. I used to call that the hole. The rim gap, in a seated primer, that's the space between the primer cup rim and the bottom of the primer pocket. The leg gap, in a seated primer, that's the space between the bottom of the primer pocket and the anvil's legs. This gap is the main focus of these videos. Ideally, the leg gap should be 0 and the anvil will be fully supported and braced against the primer pocket. The pinch gap, that's the space between the nose of the anvil and the bottom of the primer cup. It's where all the action takes place. When the anvil is seated into the primer, some compression of the powder occurs. But if the anvil is left unsupported in the leg gap, then the anvil is free to release or move in that direction, and only the friction fit of the anvil within the cup retains its position. So if you seat your anvils flush with the rim, you should seat the primer in the pocket as deep as it will go. The primer should bottom out in the pocket with the legs making positive contact, but you should expect to see a primer that is seated unusually deep. When the firing pin distorts the primer cup, the primer compound is compressed. Countless highly localized chemical reactions occur within the pinch gap. Heat is generated by both friction and the rapid compression and rupture of the explosive crystals found within the compound. Other ingredients provide both fuel and oxygen to keep the reaction going. These reactions spawn and spread rapidly throughout the primer. I think a good percentage of the time with failure to fires or multi-strikes are when the anvil isn't quite touching the bottom of the primer cup. The firing pin does its job and dents the cup. The anvil may move or flex, but it doesn't make solid contact with the bottom of the pocket. Multi-strikes may have to occur before the anvil finally bottoms out or sufficient compression is achieved. To overcome any large gaps within the primer pocket, JB of the MeWe group Primer Reloading shared his method termed pocket seating the anvil. He uses a large syringe and injects the primer cups with an EPN 0 paste. This is kind of neat where the needle actually forms a small divot to help position the anvil. But what makes this method unique is that he sets, not seats, his anvil on top of the dried compound and later seats the anvil to the perfect height while using the confines of the primer pocket as his gauge. The loose anvil doesn't have to be perfectly straight. It will self-center and right itself while being inserted into the primer pocket. The leg gap will always be 0 and positive contact will always be established between the anvil and the pocket. As he seats the primer fully and below flush of the casing's head, it will establish a little additional pressure on the compound, which is known as crush depth. A crush depth of a few thousandths will increase primer sensitivity. Pocket seating requires a certain primer press design, meaning vertical in its design where gravity isn't working against you. I might add that JB further ensures he minimizes his FTFs by maker match sorting his cups and anvils. This will give you the best possible factory fit between the cup and the anvil. More on this can be found on my website. EPH20 has some unique properties that must be considered when attempting to pocket seat the anvil. It's not like beach sand where you can re-wet it and reform the material. EPH20 sets up very quickly, and once activated, it only takes a few moments to cure to a concrete-like material. Soaking or completely submerging a hardened pellet of EPH20 will remain rock solid. Once it hardens, the anvil can't be installed or repositioned. Doing so will crack or shatter the compound, and an FTF will probably be the result. But with these considerations in mind, pocket seating with EPH20 will require the powder be extremely wet or extremely dry. If you're pocket seating wet, you may consider using a spray bottle to keep all your primers in the tray completely saturated until you're ready to install the primers. Do not let the compound harden. On the other hand, I've tried pocket seating the anvil with completely dry, unactivated compound, and then activate the primer through the flash hole using a small syringe. This works, but tests are somewhat limited using this radical approach. This is Mark on aardvarkreloading.com. If you have the financial means, donations on Patreon would be appreciated, but not required. Details below. If you already are a contributor, I really couldn't afford to publish or maintain this site on my own. Thank you. Feel free to ask questions at the MeWe group called Primer Reloading for Beginners. Hope to see you there.